Welcome to Modern Crime Scope, a channel dedicated to exploring real and fictionalized true crime stories that uncover the hidden tensions, shocking twists, and haunting mysteries behind everyday lives. Our goal is to bring you gripping storytelling, detailed breakdowns, and thought-provoking narratives that keep you hooked from start to finish. If you're fascinated by crime, investigation, and the human psyche, you've come to the right place. Daniel Johnson was once seen as just another troubled young man living quietly with his parents, Evelyn and Mark, and his younger sister, Emily. But behind the closed doors of their suburban home, years of tension and resentment were festering. What began as ordinary family arguments over chores and responsibilities spiraled into a violent outburst that would leave a community in shock. When Daniel finally snapped during a fight over something as trivial as dirty dishes, the Johnson family's life was shattered forever. The Johnson family appeared to outsiders as the picture of suburban normalcy. Their two-story house sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees, where neighbors waved politely as they passed, and children played safely in front yards. To those who lived nearby, the Johnsons blended in with ease. They attended local community events. Their yard was well kept, and nothing about them suggested turmoil behind closed doors. But beneath this polished surface, cracks had been forming for years. What looked like stability was really a home filled with constant friction, where minor disagreements grew into storms and peace was fragile at best. The household revolved around routines that were supposed to keep order but instead created tension. Each family member had responsibilities, and when one person fell behind, blame came quickly. At the center of these disputes was Daniel Johnson, the youngest member of the family at 22 years old. He had dropped out of college after just one semester, unable to keep up with the pressure of academics and social expectations. Since then, he had been living at home, unemployed and struggling to find a direction in life. His parents, Evelyn and Mark, grew increasingly frustrated with him. They believed he lacked discipline, and their disappointment often came out in sharp words. Even his younger sister, Emily, found opportunities to mock him, treating him as though he were a burden to everyone around him. The tension inside the Johnson household was not marked by violent outbursts or criminal behavior, at least not at first. Instead, it was a slow erosion of trust and respect. What might have been a single careless remark from his father one day, or a sarcastic jab from his sister another, built up inside Daniel like water filling a cracked glass. Each slight, each criticism, collected quietly until the weight of it threatened to burst. The family never suspected how deeply these moments affected him. They assumed his anger was temporary, something that would fade with time. But Daniel carried every word like a scar, hidden yet permanent. The arguments often revolved around ordinary things: unwashed laundry, misplaced items, forgotten chores. More than anything else, it was the kitchen that became the battlefield of the Johnson home. Piles of dirty dishes seemed to symbolize everything wrong in the family. Evelyn saw them as evidence of Daniel's laziness. Mark saw them as a lack of responsibility. Emily used them as ammunition to humiliate her brother. And Daniel saw them as proof that nothing he did was ever enough. Each time he was confronted about the mess, it felt less like a request for help and more like an attack on his very existence. For outsiders, it would be difficult to believe that something as simple as household chores could ignite the level of hostility building in the Johnson home. Yet, within those walls, the conflict over dishes was never really about the dishes at all. It was about control, power, and resentment. The plates and glasses piling in the sink became symbols of a much deeper war. No one in the family realized that these small battles were setting the stage for something far more catastrophic. The pressure inside the Johnson household had been mounting for years, and it was only a matter of time before it erupted in a way that would shock the entire community. Daniel Johnson's quiet withdrawal from the rest of the family did not happen overnight. It began gradually, with fewer words at the dinner table and more time spent locked away in his room. At first, Evelyn and Mark dismissed it as a phase, believing he simply needed time to figure himself out after leaving college. But weeks turned into months, and Daniel's isolation only deepened. He rarely left the house, and when he did, it was usually in the late hours of the night, wandering the empty streets with no clear destination. Inside his room, he immersed himself in online worlds, reading articles, scrolling endlessly through forums, and sinking further into his own bitterness. His family noticed the changes, but instead of addressing them with compassion, they responded with more criticism, which only made him retreat further. The family dynamic grew increasingly strained. Evelyn's frustration often boiled over into long lectures about wasted potential. Mark, who worked long hours to provide for the household, had little patience for Daniel's lack of progress. He saw his son as someone refusing to grow up, refusing to take on responsibilities that were expected of him. Emily, though younger, found it easy to side with their parents, mocking Daniel for his unemployment and lack of ambition. Each remark, each jab, chipped away at him. To them, the comments may have seemed harmless, even motivational at times, but to Daniel, they were proof that he would never be accepted, never be good enough. The kitchen sink remained a constant reminder of this fractured dynamic. Daniel avoided washing the dishes, not out of laziness, but out of resentment. Each plate or glass seemed to represent a fight waiting to happen, and he could not bear the thought of giving in. It wasn't about the chore itself anymore. It was about the power struggle that came with it. When Evelyn scolded him about the dishes, he heard only her disappointment in him as a son. When Mark barked at him to take responsibility, he felt the weight of years of rejection. When Emily laughed about the mess, he saw a sibling who enjoyed seeing him fail. These moments pushed Daniel further into a mindset where every conflict, no matter how small, felt like an attack on his very identity. Over time, Daniel began nurturing dark thoughts. He imagined scenarios where he could finally silence the voices that constantly criticized him. Late at night, when the house was quiet and everyone else was asleep, he would sit awake in the glow of his computer screen, searching for stories of other young men who had snapped under similar pressures. Some accounts fascinated him, not because of the violence, but because they reflected the loneliness he felt so deeply. He began to see himself in those stories, a misunderstood figure pushed to the edge by people who were supposed to care about him. His parents had no idea of the storm brewing inside their son. They assumed his silence meant he was indifferent, not realizing it was the opposite, that he was listening to every word, internalizing every slight. His outward passivity was a mask for the bitterness building within. The Johnson home became a pressure cooker, each family interaction tightening the lid. What none of them realized was that Daniel was inching closer to a breaking point, a moment when his pent-up anger would no longer remain confined to his thoughts. The argument that would set it all off was just around the corner, waiting in the most ordinary of places, the family kitchen. Sunday afternoon in the Johnson home began like countless others, quiet and uneventful at first. The sun filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the kitchen table, where unfinished breakfast dishes still sat. Evelyn was tidying the living room, Mark dozed in his recliner after a long week at work, and Emily scrolled on her phone upstairs. The stillness should have been comforting, but instead it felt heavy, like a silence waiting to be broken. For Daniel, the sight of the kitchen sink overflowing with dirty plates felt like an accusation before a word was even spoken. He knew it would not be long before someone confronted him. That confrontation came swiftly, and once it began, the fragile calm collapsed entirely. Evelyn's sharp voice cut through the quiet as she called attention to the pile of dishes. To her, it was the latest example of Daniel's failure to pull his weight around the house. Mark added his own frustration, his words firm and uncompromising. From upstairs, Emily chimed in mockingly, amplifying the sting of their criticism. What might have been an ordinary disagreement for another family quickly became a full-blown argument in the Johnson home. The volume of their voices rose, filling the house with anger. Daniel's chest tightened with each word, his resentment boiling over. He was not simply being scolded for chores. He felt cornered, attacked, and humiliated all at once. He slammed his fist against the table in a rare outburst, startling his parents. But instead of calming the situation, it only made things worse. Mark stood to his feet, his tone more forceful, his disappointment laid bare. Evelyn, frustrated and exhausted by years of the same argument, matched her husband's intensity. Emily's mocking laughter floated down from upstairs, and with it, Daniel's last shred of self-control snapped. For years, he had swallowed his anger, locked it inside where no one could see. But in that moment, standing in the kitchen with his family's voices tearing into him, something inside him broke beyond repair. Without a word, Daniel stormed out of the kitchen and disappeared into his bedroom. The shouting continued behind him, muffled now by the walls, but the sound of it only fueled his rage. Inside his room, he opened the drawer where he had hidden the handgun he purchased months earlier. He had never told anyone about it, never shown it to a friend, never even fired it at a range. It was supposed to be a secret source of control, a way of convincing himself he had some power in a world where he always felt powerless. Now, as he held the cold weight of the gun in his hands, he felt a surge of determination he had never known before. Moments later, Daniel returned to the kitchen. The argument had not stopped. His parents were still waiting to unload their anger. But their words froze when they saw the weapon in his hand. In that split second, the air seemed to vanish from the room. Before anyone could move or plead, Daniel raised the gun and pulled the trigger. The sound of the first shot shattered the walls of the house, echoing down the quiet street. Panic erupted instantly. Evelyn fell, Mark staggered back, and Emily screamed from upstairs. More shots followed, each one louder than the last, each one pushing the Johnson family further into a nightmare that had begun with nothing more than a fight over dishes. The neighborhood, usually so calm, was shaken by the gunfire. Dogs barked, neighbors rushed to their windows, and calls to 911 flooded in. Inside the Johnson home, chaos replaced years of simmering resentment. In seconds, an ordinary Sunday had turned into a horror that no one could have predicted. The silence that followed the final shot was not peace, but devastation. The kind that would haunt the community long after the sound faded. The sound of gunfire tore through the peaceful neighborhood, sending shockwaves beyond the walls of the Johnson home. Within moments, frantic neighbors dialed 911, their voices trembling as they described what they had just heard. Sirens soon wailed in the distance, growing louder with each second. Inside the house, the once loud argument had been replaced by chaos. Evelyn lay bleeding on the kitchen floor, struggling for breath, while Mark, wounded and disoriented, stumbled toward her. Upstairs, Emily hid inside her bedroom closet, tears streaming down her face as she pressed a hand over her mouth to muffle her sobs. Every creak of the floorboards made her believe Daniel was coming for her next. Daniel himself fled the scene in a haze of adrenaline and panic. He left the gun behind on the kitchen counter, its presence an eerie reminder of what he had done. Rushing out the back door, he vanished into the alleys behind the neighborhood. His heart racing, his mind overwhelmed by the irreversible act he had just committed. The street outside was beginning to stir with people stepping out of their homes, drawn by the noise. By the time the first police cars arrived, Daniel had already disappeared, leaving behind a trail of devastation. Officers entered the Johnson home cautiously, weapons drawn, unsure if the shooter was still inside. The sight that greeted them was one they would not forget. Evelyn was alive, but barely, her shallow breaths growing weaker. Mark, though gravely wounded, managed to point toward the kitchen and whisper Daniel's name before collapsing. Upstairs, Emily was discovered trembling, her face pale, her clothes damp with sweat. She could hardly speak. But through broken words, she managed to explain what had happened. Her brother had opened fire during an argument and fled. The officers quickly called for medical teams, who rushed Evelyn and Mark to waiting ambulances while comforting Emily, who was too shocked to process the full reality of what had occurred. The scene outside the Johnson home became a spectacle of flashing lights, police tape, and camera crews as news spread quickly. The neighborhood, once a quiet refuge, was now the backdrop of a crime scene that would soon dominate headlines. Reporters scrambled to gather details, and neighbors huddled together in disbelief. Some recalled hearing the family argue in the past, but never imagined it could end in such a violent tragedy. Others expressed sorrow for Evelyn, Mark, and Emily, but struggled to comprehend how Daniel, a young man they had seen mowing the lawn or walking alone at night, could have carried out such an act. For investigators, the priority shifted to finding Daniel before he could harm anyone else. Patrol cars combed the streets while helicopters scanned from above. Detectives traced his movements, piecing together information from surveillance cameras, gas station clerks, and witnesses who reported seeing a nervous young man matching his description. Each lead drew them closer, but for the moment, Daniel remained at large. The urgency grew by the hour, as authorities feared his unstable mindset could push him toward more violence if not caught quickly. That night, the Johnson house sat dark and silent, sealed off by crime scene tape. For the community, the shock was just beginning to sink in. Families locked their doors, whispered their fears, and struggled to sleep knowing a shooter was still on the loose. What had begun as a family dispute over dirty dishes had spiraled into a nightmare, leaving two parents fighting for their lives, a sister traumatized beyond words, and a manhunt underway for the son who had turned his anger into violence. Daniel's escape after the shooting stretched into 2 long, nerve-wracking days. Police circulated his photo across television screens, cell phones, and highway billboards. Every gas station, bus terminal, and motel was under surveillance. Tips poured in from citizens who thought they had spotted him, though many turned out to be false leads. Still, each sighting built a picture of his path. He moved mostly at night, keeping to side streets and alleyways, carrying nothing but a backpack stuffed with clothes and the little cash he had hidden away. Surveillance footage from a corner store showed him buying bottled water and a snack, his face pale and strained, glancing constantly over his shoulder. Authorities believed he was desperate and frightened, but still unpredictable. Meanwhile, the community grieved. The Johnson family's name was splashed across newspapers and television reports, their private pain exposed to the world. Evelyn and Mark remained in critical condition at the hospital, undergoing surgeries and clinging to life. Emily, though physically unharmed, faced the crushing weight of trauma. She gave her statement to detectives, recounting how her brother had turned their home into a battlefield. Neighbors brought flowers and candles, leaving them on the family's lawn, while others locked their doors more tightly than ever. Parents struggled to explain to their children how something so horrific could happen in a house so much like their own. The turning point in the manhunt came late on the second night. A clerk at a small gas station on the edge of town recognized Daniel from the news. He had wandered in, hood pulled low, hands shaking as he bought fuel for a car he had stolen earlier. The clerk quietly triggered the silent alarm while keeping his composure, handing Daniel his change as if nothing were wrong. Within minutes, squad cars converged on the area, blocking off nearby roads. Daniel tried to leave the station, but flashing lights and armed officers surrounded him. Exhausted and realizing there was no way out, he dropped to his knees and surrendered without a fight.